as far as politics is concerned.
Sounds good.
All right, I'll share the screen. Oh, host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Okay, here we go. I just okay, pass it on to you.
Okay. How's it look?
Looks good.
Okay. All right. Well, so my talk this evening is just a brief look at how political cartoons throughout history have proven to have the power to inspire, outrage, amuse, and inform. I'll show how by visually addressing issues head-on, political cartoons can provide entertainment at the expense of politicians, offer critical analyses of current events, enrich political debates, and deepen divides. Simply through a system of symbols, pictures, and words, amplified through composition, shadow, and line, political cartoons can capture complex issues inside a single box and communicate a clear message so that readers will not only understand the intended meaning of the cartoon, but also better understand the issue that the cartoonist addresses. A political cartoon invites greater involvement than reading through an op-ed column, and as a result, a cartoon's latent message may slip more successfully than an editorial through the filters which readers have to protect themselves from ideas that run contrary to their beliefs or interests. The editorial cartoonist can wield extraordinarily persuasive power over our subconscious because we absorb lasting impressions that, without our even being aware, mold our opinions. As such, political cartoons have established themselves as a powerful force in shaping the public discourse. The British printmaker James Gillray is widely regarded as the father of the political cartoon as we now know it. He was the first to combine caricature with satiric wit and biting commentary as a way in which to call attention to the hypocrisy and corruption in politicians of all parties. Gillray caricatured hundreds of his contemporaries, but he most mercilessly mocked Napoleon Bonaparte, who he often portrayed as a tiny figure full of hot air and overconfidence. Gillray produced some 40 satires on various aspects of Napoleon's ambitions and actions. Napoleon found Gillray's caricatures of him so damaging to his international reputation that he reportedly claimed that they, quote, did more than all the armies of Europe to bring me down. This is Manic Ravings, or Little Boney in a Strong Fit, which was inspired by a diplomatic incident that occurred on March 14th, 1803 at the Tuileries Palace. On that day, in front of hundreds of European dignitaries.
Can hear.
Okay, my fault here. Hold on a second. Eileen, can you unmute yourself?
Unmute.
There we
Nice.
go. Right. Sorry about that. That was my fault. No, you're back. You muted again. Bottom left. There we go.
How's that?
Okay, perfect.
Okay. So where was I? I was back at Little Boney and his strong fit. Okay. So March 14th, 1803, we're at the Tuileries Palace. And on that day, in front of hundreds of European dignitaries, Napoleon vented his rage at Lord Whitworth, the British ambassador to whom this print is dedicated, about the relationship that had developed between England and France. Afterwards, the British press reported that Napoleon had threatened an invasion of England. Manic Ravings depicts what Gilray imagines as the moment when Napoleon read these newspaper reports. With one hand on his head, tearing out his hair, and one leg raised awkwardly in the air, Napoleon's eyes contain a wild, frenzied look, and his grimacing mouth is turned downwards to exemplify his distress. He rants and raves, stamps his feet while trampling on treaties and other documents amid the upturned chaos of his furniture, including a damaged globe punctured where Europe should be. Surrounding Napoleon's head are swirling phases that fill the background like angry flames, all making reference to his disagreeable feelings toward Britain. His words are disjointed and jumbled, suggesting the notion of a frantic mind. He lashes out, English newspapers, oh, English newspapers, hated and betrayed by the French, despised by the English, laughed at by the whole world. Treason, treason, George, revenge, revenge. Gilray portrays Napoleon as small and withered, little bony, but Napoleon was probably of average height. The standard explanation for Napoleon's mistaken shortness is that French inches of the era differed from the imperial inch. So his reported height of 5'2" was mistranslated. But it was actually Gilray who, despite never having seen Napoleon in the flesh, initiated the legend of his small stature. He always portrayed him as a short-tempered, child-sized figure, and this soon became the accepted standard for caricatures of the Frenchman. In 1831, Charles Philippon was hauled into court for publishing The Replastering, a print that represented King Louis-Philippe as a mason plastering over the promises of the 1830 July Revolution. Philippon tried to avoid prison by demonstrating in court that cartoons published in his magazine, Le Caricature, should not be interpreted as harmful to the king because, as he argued, any object can be drawn to resemble the king's face, or anything else for that matter. Philippon chose to prove his point by drawing the now famous quartet of images in which the recognizable face of the king gradually metamorphoses into a pear. Philippon asked the court whether the ultimate resemblance between king and pear meant that one could no longer draw pears. But it was also a clever insult as a verbal visual pun, since pois means both pear and fathead, or simpleton in French slang. Images of the king as a pear were soon circulated in lithographs published by Philippon and Le Caricature, and Honoré Daumier also got into the act by weaponizing the innocent image of a pear to criticize the corrupt and repressive policies of King Louis-Philippe. Subsequently, the pear became a pictorial stand-in for the king and an emblem of the entire political regime of Louis-Philippe. As such, it evolved into a widely used reference and symbol of the revolution, even outside of Paris. It should be noted that despite Philippon's ingenious defense based on the mutating pear, he was convicted of contempt of the king's person and received a sentence of 6 months in prison and a fine of 2,000 francs. Turning to the United States, Thomas Nast is considered by many to be the father of American political cartoons, and to this day is regarded as the greatest American master of the medium. His career spanned 1855 to 1901, and as a political cartoonist, Nast wielded more influence than any other artist of the 19th century. He had artistic talent, keen political perception, devastating satire, inventive genius, and unquenchable convictions. His cause was the preservation of the Union, and his platform was Harper's Weekly, one of the first periodicals to achieve national circulation. He joined Harper's in 1862 at the age of 22, and it's been said that his impact on American public life was formidable enough to profoundly affect the outcome of every presidential election during the period of 1864 to 1884. The drawing that turned Nast into the most powerful political cartoonist in American history wasn't at all funny. Yet it was one of his favorites, drawn when the artist was not quite 24 years old. Compromise with the South was published in Harper's Weekly in September 1864.
I got the mail. There's nothing for you.
We see a defeated and disabled Union soldier on the left, his face hidden in shame, extending a feeble hand of surrender to a triumphant Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy. Davis stands with one boot disrespectfully on the grave of another Union soldier, while Columbia, who personified the national spirit, kneels mournfully. In the upper left, the American flag is hung upside down as a sign of distress. The headstone is engraved in memory of our Union heroes who fell in a useless war. The cartoon blasted the anti-Civil War peace platform adopted by the Democrats, and Nast's message was clear. If the Democrats pursue a compromise with the Confederacy, then Union servicemen will have sacrificed their limbs and lives in vain, and Black Americans will be returned to slavery. In the 1864 presidential election, Abraham Lincoln was facing the Democratic candidate George McClellan. Lincoln's Republican Party printed up millions of copies of Nast's cartoon and distributed them everywhere. Not only did Nast's popularity skyrocket, but his cartoon was credited with helping to turn the tide in favor of Lincoln. Its success was so great as to bring volunteers to the North and threatening letters from the South. Lincoln acknowledged the cartoon's effectiveness and later called Nast, quote, the Union's best recruiting sergeant. In his heyday, Nast had the power and influence to create or destroy politicians. In 1872, 3 years after Lincoln's assassination, Nast struck again by helping to re-elect Ulysses S. Grant with an unrelenting pictorial assault on opponent Horace Greeley. Nast was a staunch Republican, and Horace Greeley, the eccentric publisher of the New York Tribune, had won the presidential nominations of the Democratic Party. Nast saved his most vicious attacks for Greeley because Nast was a very good friend of Grant and because Greeley was such an easy target. His rumpled clothes, wispy beard, wire glasses, and shifting politics all played into Nast's talent for caricature. Nast often rendered Greeley's name as Horace Greedy, or even Horrors Greedy. Here Greeley's portrayed busting his buttons in a manic jig. Solicitations for votes pour out of his hat. In Greeley's pocket is a pamphlet titled, What I Know About Blowing My Own Trumpet. Greeley lived on a farm about 35 miles north of New York City where he applied experimental scientific methods to agriculture. In 1871, he published a book called What I Know of Farming, and Nast consistently played on the title to mock Greeley's perceived pretense of being an expert on various subjects. By accepting the nomination from the Democrats, Greeley had hitched himself to Southern diehards, and Nast had no problem using guilt by association to paint Greeley's hands bloody. Greeley made reconciliation with the South central to his campaign, clasping his hands across the bloody chasm, as he put it. And so Nast created a number of clasping hands cartoons in which he would incorporate the Ku Klux Klan, John Wilkes Booth over the grave of Lincoln, and former Confederate soldiers. Here he shows Greeley trying to extend his reach across the vast expanse of Union graves at Andersonville Prison in an effort to connect with the hand of a tiny hooded figure on the far side. During the Civil War, at least 13,000 Union men had perished of starvation or disease at the notorious Confederate prison. Just 7 years after the Civil War, resentments ran deep. Greeley's vice presidential running mate, Governor Benjamin Gratz Brown, was reduced to insignificance by appearing as a name tag on Greeley's coattails. Nast always portrayed Greeley's running mate as a clothing tag hanging from Greeley. Gratz Brown was the governor of Missouri and almost entirely unknown outside of his state. It's said that Nast at first used the tag because he didn't know how to draw Gratz Brown, and then he decided to keep it as a way in which to ridicule the governor. So as with Gilray's portrayal of Napoleon, it's important to point out that one of the reasons why political cartoons of the 19th century wielded such tremendous influence in presidential races is because they were essentially the only pictures of the candidates that voters had, aside from the more respectful hand-drawn portraits. Grant defeated Greeley and later attributed his presidential victory to the sword of Sheridan, a top Union general, and the pencil of Thomas Nast. Nast became known as the president maker because his persuasive cartoons proved so crucial in influencing the nation's vote and affecting the outcomes of 6 presidential elections. But his illustrations could be scathing, and his attacks against Greeley was one of the meanest against a presidential candidate. He himself recognized that he could be caustic, and so shortened his name to T. Nast, and often with the last name first, Nast T. When asked about Nast's cartoons, Greeley told friends, quote, "I thought I was running for the presidency, not for the penitentiary." As a brief aside, not only did Nast take on politicians, but he also played a role in creating the modern image of Santa Claus. In the early 19th century, Santa looked like this 1821 illustration. Inspired by Clement Clark Moore's 1823 poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, Nast began to immortalize the mythic figure of Santa Claus. This 1881 image, known as Merry Old Santa Claus, is probably Nast's most famous of the Santas. And while to the casual observer, it looks like Santa with his bag of toys wearing his characteristic red suit, it's actually pro-Union Army propaganda related to the government's indecisiveness over paying higher wages to members of the military. On its back, it's thought that he's not carrying a sack full of toys, but it's an army backpack from enlisted men. He's wearing a dress sword and belt buckle to represent the army, and the toy horse, which is a little hard to make out, but it's just to the left of the doll, under his arm. The toy horse suggests a Trojan horse, symbolizing the treachery of the government. At that time, the military was due for getting a raise, and Nast knew how hard they worked and how they'd helped shape the country. A pocket watch showing a time of 10 till midnight indicates the US Senate has little time left to give fair wages to the men of the Army and Navy. After Nast, Joseph Kepler was especially influential. He founded the satire magazine Puck in 1876, in part to promote the Democratic Party causes and candidates. Puck was an immediate success thanks to irreverent humor and innovative color printing techniques. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, Puck was one of the leading American illustrated magazines and America's first successful political satire magazine. It lasted nearly 40 years. Forbidding the Banns was one of Kepler's most popular cartoons. It was an indictment of the Republican candidate James Garfield's participation in the Credit Mobilier scandal, an incident involving the illegal manipulation of contracts by the construction and finance company and the building of the Union Pacific Railroad. Credit Mobilier of America became a symbol of post-Civil War corruption. Garfield is shown as a bride in a wedding dress, and the ballot box is about to pronounce Uncle Sam, representing the entire nation, and Garfield as man and wife. The father of the bride is the Republican chairman, Marshall Jewell, and the rest of the party and congregation are all Republicans. At the far left, Democratic chairman W.H. Barnum rushes in shouting, "I forbid the Banns." He's holding Garfield's supposed baby he had out of wedlock. The baby is labeled $329, which is a little hard to see, but it is there on the baby's bib. The $329 refers to the amount of money Garfield was said to have received in the Credit Mobilier scandal. Garfield's coy response, "But it was such a little one," doesn't seem to comfort the aghast groom. Forbidding the Banns was the most notorious cartoon of the 1880 presidential campaign. However, Americans were not shocked by the suggestion of Garfield being involved in a financial scandal, but by portraying him as an unwed mother. Garfield won the election to the dismay of Kepler. Although Garfield's victory would be short-lived, he was assassinated only a few months into office. But what's especially significant about this cartoon is that during the campaign, the Democrat supporters utilized the number that Kepler had provided in this cartoon by chalking the figure, 329, on fences, walls, and buildings to remind voters of Garfield's participation in the Credit Mobilier scandal. In this way, Kepler considered his cartoon a success because, as he himself said, his intention, quote, was to introduce a recurring symbol or theme into each presidential contest. In 1896, William Randolph Hearst enlisted the cartoonist Homer Davenport to produce a series of cartoons that he published in his New York Journal, this time to oppose presidential candidate William McKinley. As McKinley had an unblemished record in politics, it was decided to concentrate the attack on his campaign manager, Mark Hanna, a wealthy Midwestern industrialist. Davenport drew over and over again a grossly overweight Hanna in a suit covered with dollar signs to suggest his greed and manipulation. The cartoons reportedly brought Hanna to tears, but McKinley won, partly because his rival, William Jennings Bryan, was even more widely caricatured by cartoonists as a backward Bible thumper. Cartoons from the McKinley-Bryan race caused enough of a stir to inspire legislation in New York and other states to make it easier to sue cartoonists and their bosses for libel. The legislation failed, but it underscored the potency of these drawings. Davenport left Hearst's paper in mid-1903 and was hired by the New York Mail, a Republican daily that paid him $1,000 a week for 6 months. The Republicans spent $200,000 circulating the largest vote-getting cartoon in the history of American politics. Davenport drew Uncle Sam with his hand on the shoulder of Theodore Roosevelt and the caption, "He's good enough for me," in support of Roosevelt as a Republican candidate in that year's presidential campaign. The cartoon caught fire. It was used on posters and billboards, postcards and lapel pins, handbills and pamphlets, and aided the president's reelection. And this is a commemorative inauguration pin. In the early 20th century, the advent of photographs pushed cartoons off front pages to the editorial pages, and cartoonists watched their sway slip. Many of them began to opt for less offensive images. One of the most popular cartoonists of the era, Clifford Berryman, made the most impact on the public's memory of Theodore Roosevelt as the creator of the iconic teddy bear cartoon that's forever linked with Roosevelt. This cartoon resulted from a bear hunting trip that Roosevelt was on in November 1902. Unlike the other hunters in the group, Theodore had not located a single bear, so his assistants captured a black bear, then summoned Roosevelt and suggested that he shoot it. Roosevelt, however, refused to shoot the bear. News of this event spread quickly, and Berryman decided to satirize the president's refusal to shoot the bear. When his cartoon appeared in the Washington Post on November 16, 1902, Morris Mictum, a Brooklyn candy shop owner, saw it, and he and his wife Rose, who made stuffed animals, decided to create a stuffed toy bear and dedicate it to the president. He called it Teddy's Bear. The birth of television in the 1950s and the spread of color photographs in newspapers and magazines gave political cartoons even more competition. This time, however, artists struck back with bolder and more irreverent work. Leading the movement was Herbert L. Bloch, better known by his pen name Herb Bloch, who was so out front in combating Senator Joseph McCarthy's communist witch hunt that in a cartoon published in the Washington Post on March 29, 1950, he coined the term McCarthyism. The cartoon shows a reluctant GOP elephant being pushed toward a McCarthyism platform. Nixon was excellent fodder for cartoonists, but the greatest of them all was Herb Bloch. Herb Bloch was the first person to call Richard Nixon Tricky Dick, and he followed Nixon's political career to its downfall. A widely printed cartoon portrait can become the established image of a political figure in the public's mind. In 1954, Herb Bloch drew a stubbly-faced Nixon, who was then the US vice president, climbing out of the sewer. When Nixon decided to run for president, he reportedly said, quote, "I have to erase the Herb Bloch image." Herb Bloch also graphically captured the Watergate story in more than 100 drawings done between June 1972 and August 1974. In June 72, when 5 men were arrested at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate in Washington, both Nixon's re-election campaign manager, John Mitchell, and Attorney General Richard Kleindienst denied involvement. Although the Nixon campaign did its best to dispel rumors, Herb Bloch pointed a finger at those involved and castigated President Nixon for his role in the Watergate break-in, even as other cartoonists continued to support his presidential campaign. According to James Billington, the Librarian of Congress, quote, "No cartoonist or commentator in America has done more to educate and inform the public about Watergate than Herb Bloch." Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Charles Schulz was the most widely read cartoonist of all time. His Peanuts strip had an audience of 355 million people worldwide. Schulz never stated a party allegiance, but he was very interested in politics. In 1968, fans across America adopted a Snoopy for President campaign, which was a welcome departure from the tumultuous politics of that era. Schulz's Peanuts characters never commented on real-world politics. Schulz found a way to incorporate a political statement that readers could interpret in their own different ways. In the election years of 60, 64, and 68, the Peanuts characters became involved in presidential storylines, but often disguised as classroom politics. Political cartoons have been causing controversy for centuries and, in some instances, even violence. As I noted in my introduction, from the merely prickly to the wickedly satirical, political cartoons, because of their visual immediacy, can stir up passions more readily than long editorials. Recently, some newspapers have decided to stop running editorial art because they feel that it's become too divisive, particularly in the current political climate. One editor recently told the Washington Post, quote, "If editorial cartoonists get in the habit of lifting people up instead of tearing people apart, then everyone will want them. But then you have to ask yourself, and this is my saying this, what would be the benefit of featuring only uplifting cartoons?" In 1988, in a case concerning parody and the First Amendment's protection of freedom of speech and the press, the Supreme Court defended Hustler magazine's right to satirize Jerry Falwell as a public figure. Writing the court's unanimous decision, Justice William Rehnquist noted that cartoonists have portrayed public figures through the ages in all manners, sketching Abraham Lincoln's tall, gangling posture, Teddy Roosevelt's glasses and teeth, and Franklin D. Roosevelt's jutting jaw and cigarette holder. As he concluded, quote, "Graphic depictions and satirical cartoons have played a prominent role in public and political debate. From the viewpoint of history, it's clear that our political discourse would have been considerably poorer without them." Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Yeah.
Let's.
Hi, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah. I would hate to see the end of political cartoons. They always make me think, make me laugh. And it is so sad about what's going on in France now with the teacher who was beheaded because he showed a cartoon that was featured in Charlie Hebdo. And I read a piece, you probably all read it in the Times this week, about what they're doing in the schools. And there's a no-nonsense policy. So they're actually interrogating children ages 10 and younger about any comments they have, because these children who've made comments about the showing of these cartoons have probably made some very naive remarks. And it's just so sad to me that France is dealing with this problem. I don't know what they're going to do about it. It's a real problem. Any thoughts about that, or the possibility of censorship coming up in France and elsewhere because of a more violent society?
Well, I don't know that I can speak to that because I don't know enough about what's going on there in the politics in France. I just know that I do know that, you know, in the United States, there's been a number of cases where cartoonists have been protected by freedom of speech. And so it's that case early on that failed with the libel. There's a lot more protection in the United States as far as freedom of speech. And in fact, even a few years ago, there was a really great exhibition of political art at the Library of Congress, all in the spirit of protecting the First Amendment, freedom of speech. But in France, I can't speak to that.
Other questions?
I have a question about the color used in political cartoons, you know, sort of going back. You mentioned that the color in a particular artist's cartoon made his work especially popular, right?
Yeah. You know, well, you know, it starts really early on, even with you know, Gilroy. You know, and a lot of these prints early on, they weren't published in newspapers. They were hand engraved, hand colored prints. A lot of Daumier's prints were sold in shops, and that's how I came to see them. With Puck, you know, Puck was one of the first, and in fact, the Puck building is here just a block from my house on Houston and Mulberry. The innovative ability to it was full color to publish this magazine journal.
But that was rare at the time.
It was, you know, late 19th, early 20th century, sure.
Eileen, every time you give a speech, I'm always fascinated. You always come up with something like, I didn't know that. I always thought Napoleon was just a little guy. I mean, you know, everybody thinks he was, you know, like 5'1", 5'2", or something like that. And now you're saying
it was a mistranslation of the French measurement and the imperial English. So, you know, when he was at 5'2", they thought he was short, but it was actually just the way that they were converting the inches. Yeah, and it's really Gilroy, who they say perpetuated that image of Napoleon as this little guy. And also when you see him in paintings, clearly he is shorter. I mean, he was probably about 5'7", but he was surrounded by these soldiers who were much bigger.
And yeah. But that's kind of interesting.
Hey, John, I know we don't do politics, as is evident by our presentation, which is 100% politics. I received this yesterday from Nicolas Phaidon, as John knows, in Brussels, who's a preeminent European French, but lives in Brussels, graphic novel, non-political. Anyway, this is his last book, came out a week ago. He got it to me by yesterday. He was going to watch tonight, but he sent me an email 10 minutes before we started and said he was crashing. Anybody can email me for the details. All you have to do is go Nicolas Phaidon online and you'll find all his stuff. And it's all available worldwide now.
Phaidon?
Yeah.
V-A-D-O-T, right, Rob?
Pardon me?
V-A-D-O-T, correct?
No, V-A-D-O-T. Or maybe that's what you said, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Phaidon.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing that graphic novels such as that with these cartoons have really taken off, especially within like the last 10, 15 years, I'd say, you know, rather than these individual images, cartoons.
With all due respect, there is a man named Hergé, which might suggest it's a little longer than 10 years ago.
That he was doing the graphic novels.
He invented them.
Right, yeah. But, you know, I would say like in the last 15, 20 years, they've gained even more popularity.
Yeah, they become a specialty of the Brussels political humorist establishment. Nicola, for instance, is in every week has 2 or 3 cartoons, the whole back inside page of the equivalent of L'Express, which is called Express Beef in Brussels. And he has 1 or 2 per week in Echo, which is the major political newspaper daily in Belgium. So it's big time, just as your very fabulous presentation suggested, but it's really big time in France and Belgium.
That's true. Mike was telling me the same thing. He said when he was in France, all the graphic novels, it was just kind of incredible. And we were talking, and I think I've read even recently that during the French Revolution, there was some terrible graphic cartoons with Marie Antoinette. I mean, you know, it's probably X-rated to talk about it here, but you know, but the French have been doing this for a long time. Yeah.
Nothing is X-rated anymore.
Scatological. They really get into the excrement,
Oh, wow.
the intake of food and the outtake of. There's a lot of significance attached to that.
By the way, I don't want to talk too much, but there's
Ellen?
Yeah, I had a question. I didn't realize that political cartoons fell under the banner of the umbrella of contemporary art. Is that true? And do you subspecialize in that?
Well, you know, in fact, this is not my area of specialization at all. I was, there's a group who they asked me on an annual basis to give a talk, and this year they asked me to do the political cartoons, and so Kathy asked me if I would give the talk, which I have to say I tailored a little bit because I brought in the French, the Philippe and the Daumier. The original did not have French. But it's an interesting question. So, you know, this is not I'm really more of an abstract ABEX person, contemporary American. But you know, this question of like whether cartoons are fine art or not, I mean, it's a debate. And, you know, all you have to do is look at some of these covers of the New Yorker to, you know, find your answer. I mean, I would argue that a lot of them are. There's incredible artists. This one artist whose work I love, his name is Chris Ware, W-A-R-E, and he often appears on the cover of the New Yorker. But I mean, he's truly like a cartoon artist, but his, you know, he's paying attention to color and line and composition and shadow just as much as, you know, anyone else. So a lot of people have different opinions on that.
I don't see any possible excuse for debate. If you can put sharks in tanks of formaldehyde in the lobby of a Park Avenue monumental modern building, or put a cross in a bottle filled with urine and show it in Soho, a skilled drawing which happens to have political tones is certainly in the running. And
Sure.
and a lot of the stuff in the Met is religious, and that has a point of view just as much as any political cartoon has a political point of view. Art has a point of view unless it's art that doesn't. You know, it might just be pictures and images. But I think you did a great job. By the way, I don't mean to go on, but there is a whole department at the Beaulieu, the Pompidou. A friend of mine used to run it with her husband that deals with what they call affiche and political art. Mainly it was communist stuff from the Soviet.
Right. Yeah.
But a lot of the kind of stuff that we're talking about today. But it's the French have considered it art for as long as it's been around.
Thank you.
Yes. So, Eileen, thank you so much. We really enjoyed it. It was very informative. And you pointed out so many details that I think at first glance, a lot of us may not have, may not have picked up on. And so it was a great presentation. I think we all really enjoyed it. Thank you again so much. And thank you everyone for attending, of course. This is, we have one more this year, and then next year we're going to be doing, hopefully, in-person dinners at the National Arts Club, but we'll also be Zooming the speaker's talk. So we're going to see how we can make that work. But Eileen, you're welcome to join us as our guest anytime if you would like to join us.
I would.
And we wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving. And despite maybe our plans aren't what they usually are, but we'll make the best of it, and we'll get ourselves through the rest of the year. So thank you all so much. And
I'll send you a bottle of
Everyone,
Lafite.
nice to meet all of you.
thank
Bye.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Sure.
A la próxima.